Welcome to the research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. It's also actually part of a workshop called the Ethics of Regulating Population Size, workshop on sustainable populations in the time of climate change. So I'm Christer Byqvist, professor of practical philosophy at Stockholm University. I'm also a research leader, co-PI here at the Institute, co-PI for the Climate Ethics Project. So today, very honored to welcome today's speaker, Emily Klancher Merchant. And she's a professor of science and technology studies, University of California. So she's a historian of science and technology and medicine. She has published a lot on these issues. So there's a journal article called the Environmental Malthusianism and Demography in Social Studies of Science. But there's also a recent book, this one, which I recommend you to read, the Building the Population Bomb. And it's the same cover, you can see. There might be some relations, I think, between the book and today's presentation, in fact. So, without much ado, I welcome you to the floor. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Christer. It's great to be here. Thank you also to Gustav and Mats and Olivia for inviting me and for arranging my travel. It's been really interesting to be here with all of you and to hear about everything that everybody's thinking about these issues of sustainability and climate change and population. So, as we all know, the world is facing an unprecedented climate crisis, one that's undeniably anthropogenic in origin. The Earth is warming because humans are putting too much carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The solution, of course, is to curb our emissions. For decades now, we've been told to mind our carbon footprints. We're also told to reduce the number of carbon feet on the planet by having fewer children. Philosophers have begun to argue that their climate crisis has rendered large families inherently unethical, and they're now questioning whether anyone has the right to more than one child. But is there an ethical way to reduce the number of children people are having? As Andrew pointed out yesterday, the only other way to limit population growth at the global level is by increasing mortality, which is obviously not ethical. So is there an ethical way to reduce birth rates? I'm going to argue that there isn't, though not for the reasons that you might expect. Today's objections to attempting to limit population growth typically focus on the sordid history of population control in the second half of the 20th century. Efforts to control population originated in the global north, particularly the United States, the UK, Japan, and Sweden, and were targeted at the global south, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, though some governments in the global south eagerly adopted their own population control programs, including India, the Philippines, China, and Indonesia, to name just a few of the most notorious. Historically, governments and non-governmental agencies have taken three approaches to reducing birth rates, which were discussed yesterday. The first is legislation for limiting the number of children people can have, such as China's former one-child policy. As we saw in China, enforcing this kind of legislation typically involves severe curtailment of civil liberties, as reproduction is a fundamental biological activity. The second approach, which Andrew discussed yesterday, is financial incentives, such as fines for having large families or tax breaks for having small families. With this kind of incentive, children become consumer goods. As many people pointed out, wealthy families can have a lot of them, and poor families become even poorer if they have more than the sanctioned number. The burden of this kind of legislation, the burden of this kind of incentive program therefore falls most heavily on poor families, often families of color and their children. Historically, people who've advocated for this kind of program have seen its disproportionate impact as a feature rather than a bug, increasing the size of socially valued families and decreasing the size of socially devalued families. The third approach, which we saw from Henrik and Ulla, is education for women and expanded access to birth control. Of course, everyone should have access to education and birth control. These should be basic human rights. The problem with providing education and contraception to women as a means of reducing fertility rates is that women's education and healthcare then become instrumentalized, means to an end other than creating a healthy and educated citizenry. So this is the only a means objection. And what I'm saying is that education and reproductive healthcare should be ends of their own. This is because when the metric of success for these programs is reduced birth rates, they don't necessarily serve women's needs. And when birth rates fall too low, women risk losing access to education and contraception. Today's advocates of population control often say that they can't even begin to discuss population limitation in polite company because past efforts to slow human population growth proved so detrimental. But this argument is a red herring. I don't know if that's a phrase that you use here, but in the United States, a red herring is a misleading clue in a mystery story that's intended to distract readers from what's really going on. If limiting the number of people on the planet were the only way to save humanity, or maybe if it were even simply the most effective way, it would be incumbent upon us to find an ethical way to do it. And that's the premise that yesterday's speakers seem to be starting from. But we shouldn't take that premise for granted. The history of population control shows that it has never been an effective method of environmental protection, and complaints about the political obstacles to limiting population growth distract us from that fact. There's no ethical way to limit population growth because population is not a primary cause of any of the problems population control is intended to solve. Historically, proponents of population control have advanced their agendas as supposed solutions to global poverty and/or environmental devastation. In my 2021 book, which Krister just showed you, Building the Population Bomb, I explain how population growth came to take the blame for these problems, how population control came to seem like an effective solution, and whose interests were served by promoting population control as opposed to more direct remedies for the world's problems. The book is based primarily on archival research, but it also draws on oral history interviews done by myself and others over the past 50 years, and on computational text analysis. In this talk, I'll focus on the environmental side of the argument. In brief, I argue that climate change is driven by the quantity of emissions in the atmosphere, not the number of people on the planet. Attributing the quantity of emissions to the number of people is an accounting trick that serves the interests of the fossil fuel industry and other corporate polluters, and provides cover for racism and eugenics, all at the expense of the world's most vulnerable citizens and the planet itself. So just as a disclaimer, I'm not an ethicist or a climate scientist, I'm a historian, but these facts become visible when we examine how we came to believe that population control can protect the environment. You can find a longer and more detailed version of this argument in the article that Krister mentioned, Environmental Malthusianism and Demography, which came out earlier this year in Social Studies of Science. So just to define these terms, which you'll hear a lot in this talk, environmental Malthusianism refers to a pair of ideas. First, that population growth is a major cause of environmental degradation, and second, that population control can protect the natural environment. Demography is the social science of human population dynamics. The story I'm going to tell today may seem provincial, as it's deeply rooted in American history. That's because, as you'll see, environmental Malthusianism emerged in the context of US geopolitics and the worldwide extension of US hegemony after World War II. The talk is organized into three parts: the eugenic origins of environmental Malthusianism, demography's opposition to environmental Malthusianism, and the biogeopolitics of population control. So part one, the eugenic origins of environmental Malthusianism. The term environmental Malthusianism, of course, references the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus and his now infamous essay on the principle of population, which was first published in 1798. Malthus's essay was primarily about the political economy of population, an argument against poor relief on the grounds that charity would incentivize poor people to have more children. Malthusianism took an environmental turn in the United States in the 1920s in the hands of biologists Raymond Pearl and Edward East. Pearl and East had both served in the US Food Administration during World War I, and both men had read Malthus's essay during the war. To them, the implications were clear. If unchecked, the the population of every country and of the world as a whole would grow to their human capacity, at which point life would be miserable for everyone. East pointed to soil erosion as evidence that the United States was already beginning to exceed its capacity. What East either didn't realize or ignored was that soil erosion was not caused by too many people subsisting on U.S. agriculture, but by too many people trying to profit from U.S. agriculture. Overall, 20% of agricultural production was for export, and percentages were higher for such cash crops as wheat, corn, and cotton, two of which were not even grown for human consumption. Pearl and East disagreed with each other over how many people the Earth could support and over when that number would be reached, but they didn't let that disagreement shake their mutual faith that the world would soon be staring down the barrel of overpopulation. Pearl and East also agreed on the solution to this problem: stringent restrictions on immigration to the United States and birth control for the world's poor. They argued that nothing could prevent overpopulation, but with these eugenic solutions in place, at least the world would be overpopulated by what they considered the right kind of people. The word eugenics was coined in 1883 by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, to describe a concept he had first articulated in 1865. Galton theorized that all human characteristics, not just physical ones, were determined by some yet-to-be-identified hereditary material that was passed intact from parent to child. Just as height and shoe size were primarily determined by biological inheritance, so too were intelligence and socioeconomic status, according to Galton. He therefore postulated that breeding humans selectively like livestock was the most effective way to ameliorate poverty and improve society. Eugenics didn't catch on right away, but it gained considerable traction by the turn of the 20th century, and by the beginning of World War II, it could be found on every inhabited continent. Eugenics was particularly popular among American jurists, physicians, and scientists, including Pearl and East. Pearl had traveled to London in 1905 to study with Galton's protege, Carl Pearson. For scientists of the time, eugenics wasn't an extracurricular activity. It deeply informed their research. Until the 1930s, American eugenicists were almost uniformly in favor of immigration restriction. Between 1870 and 1920, approximately 11 million immigrants had arrived in the United States, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, East Asia, and Mexico. These new immigrants were among the poorest of the poor. In the industrial Northeast, they crowded into city slums. In the rural Southwest, they did migrant farm labor. In the Intermountain West, they laid railroad track. American eugenicists attributed immigrants' exploitation to their biology and made increasingly louder demands for immigration restriction, culminating in the passage of the 1924 National Origins Act, which barred immigration from Asia altogether and sharply curtailed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration from Mexico and other parts of the Western Hemisphere remained open until 1965, but Mexican immigrants were increasingly subject to deportation. American eugenicists were not uniformly in favor of birth control legalization. The legal landscape surrounding birth control and abortion in the United States has always been complex, as I'm sure you've noticed over the past few months. In 1920, birth control was more or less illegal nationwide, though some states were starting to relax their regulations. Margaret Sanger, the leader of the movement to legalize birth control in the United States, had recently begun to appeal to eugenics-minded scientists and physicians to become allies in her cause. For many eugenicists, birth control legalization was a non-starter. Already, middle-class couples were using birth control more than poor people, creating what eugenicists considered a dysgenic distribution of births, too many among the poor and not enough among the middle class. Eugenicists generally preferred to rely on sterilization to prevent the reproduction of those they deemed unfit. But for Pearl and East, birth control meshed with their Malthusian perspective on population. Both men joined the Scientific Council of Sanger's American Birth Control League, but they always emphasized that the purpose of birth control legalization was to reduce the size of poor families. For Pearl and East, it isn't clear whether their research informed their eugenic outlook or vice versa. Research and ideology were nearly inseparable in their writings, which blurred the line between science and activism. Pearl critiqued East's 1923 book, Mankind at the Crossroads, as propagandistic, complaining that it included too much preaching and too much over-elaboration. Yet just the year before, Pearl had published birth control propaganda of his own in the New York Times. For both men, overpopulation was the starting point for their analysis, not its outcome. There was no consensus, either between Pearl and East, or between either man and any other scientist, about how many people the Earth or any given country could sustain, or about when those numbers would be reached. In the 1930s, Pearl and East's overpopulation predictions came to seem less and less likely. Birth rates had been declining steadily since 1825, and the decline became even steeper during the Great Depression. Immigration also fell dramatically during the Depression, though it had already been reduced by the National Origins Act of 1924, and before that by World War I. Pearl and East had theorized that populations would inevitably grow until their carrying capacity was reached, with birth rates increasing when immigration rates fell, and vice versa. Pearl interpreted the simultaneous decline of fertility and immigration as a sign that the United States was nearing its carrying capacity. But this view was belied by the fact that population density was still quite low and food resources remained abundant. During the 1930s, the US government paid farmers to take land out of production to address soil erosion and avoid price collapse. Huge quantities of food were destroyed or allowed to rot. As overpopulation in the United States came to seem implausible, East shifted his focus to plant genetics, and Pearl renounced the theories he had previously espoused. But their overpopulation warnings remained in the public view through the efforts of Guy Irving Birch. In 1929, Birch established the Population Reference Bureau. The organization's mission was to present population science to the American public in ways that would promote the perception of a rapidly growing US population straining at the limits of natural resources, thereby producing popular support for eugenics and more stringent restrictions on immigration. Even as the rate of population growth declined precipitously, Birch introduced the term population explosion to arouse overpopulation anxiety and nativism among the American public. After World War II, Birch widened his focus to global population. Together with sociologist Elmer Pendell, he wrote a book that aimed to provide scientific legitimacy to eugenics and immigration restriction in a post-Holocaust world. Citing interwar publications by Pearl and East, Birch and Pendell claimed that the world had already exceeded its human carrying capacity, even though there was no scientific consensus either about the world's total human population or about the number of people the Earth could support. Birch and Pendell described the recent war as a natural result of population growth and therefore evidence of overpopulation. But overpopulation was not limited to the war's aggressors. According to Birch and Pendell, Russia had turned to communism in response to population pressure. Even the United States was not immune. Birch and Pendell described the New Deal as the beginning of tyranny creeping into the United States in response to resource scarcity and ecosystem degradation caused supposedly by population growth. And the New Deal was the interwar foundation of the US welfare state, such as it is. Birch and Pendell's critique of the New Deal reveals the ultimate target of their work, which was economic regulation. They decried any form of redistribution or limitation on economic activity as a violation of democracy necessitated by out-of-control population growth. As an alternative to economic regulation, they recommended that the populations of the United States and the world be regulated through eugenic measures, such as further restrictions on immigration, sterilization of those they deemed unfit, and birth control for the world's poor. And just as a reminder, their book was published after the Holocaust. Birch and Pendell called on the United States to impose these measures on other countries through the new United Nations, in effect asking the US and the UN to curtail the reproduction of the world's poor in order to protect the economic freedom of wealthy Americans. Two 1948 bestsellers expanded on Birch and Pendell's environmental argument for population control and spread their anxiety about population growth to a much larger audience. These books were not based on any new research on population. Their population claims came entirely from Human Breeding and Survival and other publications of the Population Reference Bureau. Historians have credited these books with launching the modern environmental movement and focusing it on human population. It would be difficult to overestimate their influence. Each sold millions of copies worldwide and garnered considerable media attention. Both books won awards and were widely translated. The authors of these books, ornithologist William Vogt and New York Zoological Society president Fairfield Osborn, portrayed humans as part of an ecological web, dependent for their very existence on the flora and fauna with which they coexisted. Vogt and Osborn contended that human greed had begun to destroy this web by promoting the mismanagement of natural resources. But the solutions they proposed, like those proposed by Birch and Pendell and by Pearl and East before them, privileged the regulation of reproduction over economic or environmental regulation. Vogt and Osborn were well aware of the role played by global capitalism in environmental destruction. Nonetheless, they placed the ultimate blame not on industrial production, the capitalist impulse toward growth, or insatiable consumer demands in the global north, but instead on the quantity of the world's inhabitants. They argued that reducing the number of people on the planet would automatically reduce production and consumption without inconveniencing producers or consumers. Vogt and Osborn thereby naturalized profit-seeking and excessive consumption as quintessential and unavoidable human activities, and blurred the distinction between inhabitants of the global north, whose productive and consumptive activities drove environmental devastation worldwide, and inhabitants of the global south, who were increasing in number more quickly, but had much smaller ecological footprints. Vogt openly acknowledged that he aimed to limit the world's poor and non-white population for the benefit of wealthy Americans. In addition to reducing birth rates, he advocated increasing death rates by withholding public health measures and food aid to countries in the global south. In contrast, Osborn simply called for fertility reduction across the board. Despite these differences, Osborn and Vogt came together in the 1950s to slow population growth in developing countries through the Conservation Foundation, which Osborn established in 1948 with the help of Lawrence Rockefeller, grandson of the co-founder of Standard Oil. So just to put a finer point on this, Lawrence Rockefeller was the grandson of the co-founder of what had been the largest petroleum company in the world, and he used his inheritance to promote population control as a means of environmental protection. The Conservation Foundation worked with the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, of which Vogt served as executive director in the 1950s. Under Vogt's direction, Planned Parenthood shifted its focus from developing birth control technologies for American women to developing population control technologies for the rapidly growing countries of the global south, and I'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. Guy Birch died in 1950, but his Population Reference Bureau survived, and Birch's life work continued through the efforts of Hugh Everett Moore. A businessman and peace activist, Moore got interested in population when he read Vogt's Road to Survival. He followed the footnotes to Birch and Pendell's Human Breeding and Survival and became a supporter of the Population Reference Bureau and a friend of Birch. With the opening of the Cold War, Birch conveyed to Moore his worry that the post-war explosion in world population could easily bankrupt the United States in its effort to support the large increase in population to prevent these areas from becoming communistic. Birch feared that continued population growth would spark renewed warfare, which promised further environmental devastation. He confided to Moore that if the population explosion continues, we are really already in it, the atomic explosion cannot be suppressed indefinitely. After Birch's death, Moore self-published a pamphlet titled The Population Bomb. It popularized Birch's explosive view of population and updated Human Breeding and Survival for the Cold War era. The first edition came out in 1954, and Moore frequently reissued it over the next 15 years. Moore's Population Bomb described population growth in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as leading inevitably to the spread of global communism and nuclear war. It called on the U.S. government to limit population growth in these parts of the world. Moore circulated the pamphlet throughout his wide social and professional network, securing the partnership of influential businessmen and diplomats. Best known among these partners was General William Henry Draper Jr., who chaired a 1958 committee charged by President Eisenhower with evaluating the U.S. military aid program. Directly influenced by Moore's population bomb, Draper recommended to Eisenhower that the United States add population limitation measures to its foreign policy. Throughout the 1960s, Moore and Draper ran full-page ads in the country's major newspapers, demanding that the U.S. government actively forestall population growth overseas. Environmental Malthusianism became a mass movement in the United States in the 1960s, galvanized by two 1968 publications. Both were clearly influenced by Vogt and Osborne. Although these works are today remembered as the foundational texts of environmental Malthusianism, they were, in their time, anything but original. Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb wove together popular concerns about population growth, the ever-looming possibility of a nuclear war, and the destruction of the natural environment. It claimed that the Earth was already overpopulated from an environmental perspective, and that nothing could prevent widespread famine in the next decade. According to Ehrlich, only a massive dieback of people could avert imminent nuclear war. For that reason, he recommended that the United States cut off food aid to countries that were already beyond hope, including India and Egypt. Ehrlich also saw overpopulation in developed countries, blaming population growth for the social, economic, and environmental ills that had mounted across the 1960s, including a recent wave of urban uprisings in the United States. As was true of the environmental Malthusians who shaped his worldview, Ehrlich pointed to the world's challenges as indicators of overpopulation without any empirical evidence of causality. The claims he made for the effects of population growth were capacious enough that empirical evidence would have been hard to come by. Within the epistemic space of environmental Malthusianism, the ills themselves were the evidence. Malthus had theorized that all of the world's problems stemmed from the pressure of population on natural resources, and had therefore viewed all of the world's problems as proof that human population really was pressing on natural resources. Nearly 200 years later, Ehrlich made the same kind of claim. To convince an audience that hadn't already accepted the Malthusian perspective, Ehrlich might have attempted to correlate population growth with environmental degradation, either cross-sectionally between locales or longitudinally within locales. He might also have carried out a simulation study, as the Club of Rome would do in 1972. But Ehrlich did none of these things, perhaps because questions of human population and the environment were far afield from his specialty in butterfly biology. Instead, Ehrlich simply asserted that the causal chain of deterioration is easily followed to its source. Too many cars, too many factories, too much detergent, too much pesticide, multiplying contrails, inadequate sewage treatment plants, too little water, too much carbon dioxide. All can be traced easily to too many people. Yet, if Ehrlich had actually tried to trace the causal link to too many people, he might have found what Barry Commoner did in 1971, namely that the increase in pollution in the United States since World War II had stemmed almost entirely from new production methods and rising per capita consumption rather than population growth. In The Tragedy of the Commons, biologist Garrett Hardin refuted Adam Smith's proposition that the emergent effect of individuals acting in their own interests would benefit society as a whole. Instead, he argued that the invisible hand of the market fails to effectively allocate resources held in common, such as air, water, and land. But the article actually treats these environmental resources as a metaphor for the material resources Hardin argued were being unfairly transferred from the more to the less deserving by the U.S. welfare state as a result of the excessive childbearing of the poor. Hardin connected welfare to the natural environment with the unsubstantiated contention that the pollution problem is a consequence of population. As a solution to the tragedy of the commons, Hardin proposed not environmental regulation, but the regulation of childbearing, which he described as mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon by the majority of people affected. Hardin's formulation elided the fact that such limits typically fall heaviest on the poor and non-white, though for him this was a plus rather than a minus. He favored governmental regulation of childbearing because he believed that poor women and women of color were least likely to use birth control on their own, and he feared their increase as a proportion of the world's population. Hardin thus cast the supposedly excessive existence of the world's poor as a threat to the very survival of the world's wealthy. Historians have recognized the influence of Vogt and Osborne on Ehrlich and Hardin, but less so that of Moore and Draper. Just before 1968, Moore and Draper had begun a new advertising campaign in American newspapers. Although they ultimately aimed to increase funding for overseas population control, Moore and Draper believed that they could more effectively pique American concern by bringing the population problem home. They accomplished this by focusing their advertisements on population growth in the United States, pointing to social strife and environmental degradation as evidence that the US population had surpassed its natural limit. Ehrlich's book borrowed more than its title from Moore's population bomb pamphlet. It also seamlessly combined the themes of Moore's pamphlet, which warned that continued population growth would inevitably lead to nuclear war, with those of Moore and Draper's new ads, which blamed population growth for environmental degradation, rising crime rates, and the social strife that threatened to tear the United States apart at the end of the 1960s. Moore mailed Ehrlich's book to his supporters with a letter stating that it expresses my own view of the frightening prospects of world population out of control. In 1968, Ehrlich became the leader of a new grassroots organization in the United States and Canada called Zero Population Growth, or ZPG for short. This organization sought to mobilize young people to commit themselves to having small families, thereby setting an example for population control overseas. Scientific claims that population growth was bad for the environment were based on little empirical evidence and always had ulterior motives. For Pearl and East, these motives were eugenics and immigration restriction. For Birch and Pendel, the motive was preventing economic regulation in the United States. For Vogt and Osborne, it was preserving the access of American industry to raw materials overseas. For Moore and Draper, it was preventing the global spread of communism. For Hardin, it was undercutting the U.S. welfare state. For Ehrlich and Zero Population Growth, as we'll see a bit later, it was preventing environmental regulation. At this point, you might be wondering where the demographers were in all of this. Ehrlich and Hardin were natural scientists, as were Vogt and Osborne, to the extent that they were scientists at all. But over the course of the 20th century, human population dynamics had come under the expertise of a new kind of social scientist, which gets us to part 2, demography's opposition to environmental Malthusianism. So let's go back to the 1920s. Biologists weren't the only scientists dealing with human population between the world wars. At the same time that Pearl and East predicted imminent overpopulation, metropolitan life insurance statisticians Alfred Jim Lotka and Louis Israel Dublin developed a non-Malthusian approach to population growth that would form the mathematical foundation for a new social science. In contrast to Pearl and East, who focused on aggregate growth rates, Dublin and Lotka focused on age-specific birth and death rates. They noticed that although the population of the United States was still growing in the aggregate, age-specific fertility rates were falling dramatically. German statistician Robert Kaczynski identified the same pattern in most countries of Western Europe. The statisticians interpreted the slowing of population growth through the lens of mercantilism, a population theory that predated Malthus and cast population growth as a sign of good government and the primary source of economic dynamism and geopolitical strength. Dublin, Lotka, and Kaczynski attributed population change to a variety of social, economic, and political factors acting on vital rates. They feared that declining rates of population growth in the United States and Western Europe would weaken those countries relative to the faster-growing countries of Eastern Europe and East Asia. While the Malthusian biologists predicted impending overpopulation, the mercantilist statisticians predicted impending depopulation. Just as the biologists had used their predictions to argue for immigration restriction and birth control legalization, the statisticians used theirs to argue against immigration restriction and birth control legalization. During the 1930s, a small number of young sociologists and economists with quantitative training began to focus their research on human population. These social scientists adopted the statisticians' vital rate approach and the mercantilist perspective that traveled along with it, and began to refer to themselves and one another as demographers. Interwar demographers espoused a different version of eugenics than the one espoused by Pearl, Reed, and Birch. Their brand of eugenics was based on the Swedish model. Its leader in the United States was Frederick Henry Osborn, cousin of Fairfield Osborn. This Osborn sought to divorce eugenics from race science, jettisoning overt racism, especially the intra-European racism that had underpinned immigration restriction. He wasn't against sterilization, but he preferred to produce a eugenic distribution of births through what he termed family planning, and Osborn actually coined the phrase family planning. What he meant was the legalization and distribution of birth control in the context of social control mechanisms that encouraged its use by the poor and uneducated and discouraged its use by the wealthy and educated. Osborn saw demography as the science that would figure out how to realize his vision of family planning. In 1936, he arranged for the establishment of the world's first graduate training program in demography, the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. By the time World War II began, demographers had become the primary authorities over human population in the United States. During the war, American demographers became the world's preeminent population experts, leading the United Nations Population Commission and Population Division after the war. These demographers largely dismissed the work of Birch, Pendel, Vogt, and Osborn, recognizing it as eugenic and capitalist ideology disguised by a thin veneer of population pseudoscience. At the 1949 meeting of the Population Association of America, which is demography's professional organization in the United States, the presidential session was devoted to critiquing Vogt and Osborn's books. But by that point, American demographers were becoming anxious about population growth for other reasons. Their version of overpopulation emerged from demographic transition theory, which was first articulated in the mid-1940s by Princeton University demographers to describe the supposedly predictable demographic consequences of modernization. Mid-20th century social scientists viewed modernity, epitomized by the United States, of course, as the pinnacle of social, political, and economic development. It was the terminus of a linear trajectory that all countries would eventually traverse. According to demographic transition theory, the supposedly universal process of modernization stimulated a brief period of population growth by reducing death rates, but also increased the number of people a society could support and eventually led to the adoption of small family norms that would halt population growth. Demographic transition theory depended on the vital rate models developed by interwar statisticians, but replaced their mercantilist veneration of population with a modernist faith in industrialization as the source of economic growth and military might. By 1949, Princeton demographer Frank Notstein and Columbia demographer Kingsley Davis had noticed that death rates were falling dramatically in some colonial territories, stimulating population growth in the absence of the modernization that they expected would trigger demographic transition. They began to fear that this population growth could actually prevent modernization. In contrast to environmental Malthusians, who understood overpopulation as an absolute excess of population size relative to natural resources on a global scale, demographers understood overpopulation as a condition in which population growth outpaced economic growth on a national scale. Notstein attributed the mismatch between population growth and economic growth not to the limits of the natural environment or to excessive reproduction, but to the structure of global capitalism. Multinational corporations extracted labor and resources from agricultural countries to enrich industrial countries. By funneling profits back to the global north, these corporations prevented modernization and promoted population growth in the global south. Although Notstein did not address the natural environment, he implicitly challenged Vogt and Osborn's assumption that population growth in agricultural countries of the global south drove the too rapid consumption of the Earth's natural resources. Rather, in Notstein's assessment, the rapacious extraction of those resources and unequal sharing of the profits therefrom fueled population growth. To solve this problem, Notstein initially proposed decolonization and local control over economic development, which he expected would stimulate the growth of indigenous middle classes worldwide and thereby trigger demographic transitions. But he found little support for this solution within the United States, perhaps because environmental Malthusianism had already captured the popular imagination through the work of the Population Reference Bureau. Instead of further developing his demographic critique of imperialism and global capitalism, Notstein soon began to recommend family planning as a means of promoting economic development in the colonial and decolonizing world. In 1952, Notstein established the Population Council, together with Frederick Osborne and John D. Rockefeller III, who was the older brother of Lawrence Rockefeller and chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. The council was a non-governmental organization that channeled money from large US-based foundations like Rockefeller and Ford into overseas family planning programs, promising to stimulate economic growth by reducing population growth. So again, we have a grandson of the co-founder of what was once the world's largest petroleum company, using corporate profits to control population growth in the global south, instead of making direct contributions to economic development. But at that time, there was no empirical evidence either that population growth prevented economic development or that population control could promote economic growth. That evidence would come from a 1958 study, which was inspired by Moore's population bomb, funded by the World Bank and the Population Council, and carried out at Princeton's Office of Population Research. The study was based entirely on simulation. Its lead author, Ansley Cole, projected India's population forward 50 years under two different fertility scenarios. Cole's co-author, Edgar Hoover, then projected India's economy forward under each population scenario. The study did not find that high fertility was a barrier to economic development. 45 years later, Cole would describe it as having predicted significant prospective economic progress, even with continued high fertility, and significant, if somewhat modest, additional progress should fertility be substantially reduced in the next generation. And in fact, that was what happened in India. The economy grew tremendously, even though fertility remained high. But in the 1960s, Cole presented the study as if it demonstrated that continued high fertility is an impediment, if not a total barrier, to economic and social development. The Population Council promoted this reading and funded the worldwide distribution of Cole and Hoover's book. In the 1960s, the Population Council and the Ford Foundation, which was closely aligned with the council, became the largest sources of funding for demography in the United States. They dramatically expanded the field, establishing population research and training centers at several major US universities, and funding training for students from all over the world, particularly the Global South, at those universities. They also focused demographic research on reducing fertility rates in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So in the post-war period, we see the emergence of two distinct population problems promoted by two separate groups of scientists. Neither had a strong empirical basis, but both were popular among American businessmen, philanthropists, and diplomats, all of whom had their own reasons for fearing population growth in the global south. Both population problems also pointed to the same solution: reduce birth rates by developing new, easy-to-use contraceptives and promoting their uptake in the global south. In the 1950s and 1960s, the demographically oriented Population Council and Ford Foundation collaborated with the three Malthusian organizations on the left to stoke public anxiety about population growth and to promote the development of new contraceptive technologies. They didn't so much care how the new technology worked or whether it was to work on male bodies or female bodies. What they wanted was something that was foolproof and could be imposed on people who were not terribly interested in preventing pregnancy. Barriers like condoms and diaphragms left too much control in the hands of the user, and Americans didn't trust the citizens of countries in the global south to reduce birth rates on their own. What they ended up with was the IUD, specifically this IUD, the Lippes loop. Made from flexible plastic, the loop cost pennies to produce and could be inserted by staff with minimal medical training, after which it would prevent conception indefinitely. Beginning in the 1960s, IUD distribution formed the core of the Population Council's family planning activities in the global south. Under Frederick Osborne's leadership, family planning meant the same thing to the Population Council that it had to the eugenics movement in the 1930s. It meant making contraceptives widely available in the context of social control mechanisms that ensured they were used by the right people. Family planning programs didn't just supply IUDs to people who already wanted them, they also promoted demand for IUDs. They did this through mass communication campaigns that touted birth control as the key to national economic development or the solution to family poverty. The Population Council even collaborated with Disney to make a film that encouraged people in agricultural countries to visit their local family planning clinics to promote the health and prosperity of their children. Family planning programs also hired motivators who were paid to convince women to have IUDs inserted. As a participant in a Population Council conference explained, once the damn thing is in, the patient cannot change her mind. In fact, we can hope she'll forget it's there, and perhaps in several months wonder why she has not conceived. This quote shows how little regard the Council's leadership had for women in the Global South and their reproductive autonomy. Nonetheless, they always described the family planning programs promoted by the Council as voluntary. Nobody was required to get an IUD or told how many children they could have. A fragile but symbiotic relationship emerged between the demographic organizations on the right and the Malthusian organizations on the left through their collaboration on the Cole-Hoover study and the development of the IUD. The popularity of environmental Malthusianism in the United States generated support for the activities of the demographic organizations, and their scientific respectability legitimized the activities of the Malthusian organizations. By the late 1960s, this partnership had generated the widespread perception, not just in the United States, but throughout much of the world, that human numbers were rising too quickly and that something needed to be done. But by that time, the relationship between the demographic organizations and the Malthusian organizations had begun to break down. Hugh Moore, William Draper, Paul Ehrlich, and Garrett Hardin were frustrated with the slow results of the nominally voluntary family planning programs promoted by demographers and the Population Council. At the same time, demographers felt that Ehrlich's population bomb, Hardin's tragedy of the commons, and Moore and Draper's new advertising campaign had gone too far. Most American demographers did not think the United States was overpopulated, and they opposed explicit limits on childbearing anywhere in the world. The Population Council defined such limits as coercive, and its leaders warned that coercive measures to force contraceptive practice are more likely to bring down the government than the birth rate. They saw population growth as a threat to economic development and political stability in the Global South, but viewed coercive population control as an even greater threat. Environmental Malthusians, on the other hand, saw population growth anywhere in the world as a threat to their very existence and considered no population control measure too extreme. Demographers initially spoke out against environmental Malthusianism primarily amongst themselves, fearing that more public opposition would undermine their economic population control agenda. In 1968, Princeton demographer Ansley Cole was president of the Population Association of America. He devoted his presidential address to the question, should the United States start a campaign for fewer births? His answer was no. Implicitly critiquing Ehrlich's population bomb, Hardin's tragedy of the commons, and Moore and Draper's newspaper ads, Cole complained that it has become fashionable to explain almost every national failure or shortcoming by rapid population growth, when the vast majority of the country's problems had little to do with population. He refuted Hardin's equation of population with pollution, pointing out that a population 1/2 or 3/4 the size of the current one in the United States could ruin the potability of our fresh water supplies and poison our atmosphere by the unrestricted discharge of waste just as easily as could a larger one. Population control would not necessarily help the environment because environmental ills were created by industry, not individuals. At the 1970 Population Association meeting, Notstein challenged Ehrlich and Hardin's attribution of environmental degradation to population growth, demonstrating that increases in pollution had far outpaced increases in population. He recognized that calls for population control were aimed not at protecting the environment, but at deterring environmental protection. He called population control a distraction from an immediate attack on pollution by more direct means. Proponents of environmental Malthusianism often portray their critics as ideological opponents of birth control or as deniers of the environmental crisis. Cole and Notestein were neither. Both were committed to the promotion of family planning as a means of stimulating economic development in the global South. Both men also favored environmental protection, but recognized that the direct regulation of pollutants would be much more effective than population control. Demographers also contested Moore, Draper, Ehrlich, and Hardin's attribution of domestic social strife to population growth. University of Chicago demographer Philip Hauser described the population explosion as a smokescreen to obscure other problems that should have priority, including the problems of the slums, racism, and the urban crisis in general. Demographer Conrad Teuber, who supervised the 1970 U.S. Census, agreed, announcing that economic and social factors are more important than population growth in threatening the quality of American life. Demographers of the 1960s and 1970s generally attacked environmental Malthusianism in professional venues rather than public ones. Nonetheless, their critique was open enough among demographers and between demographers and environmental Malthusians as to shine through clearly in the archival record. In 1970, an internal Population Council memorandum described zero population growth as a cult paying lip service to ecology, but rather lightly based in science and deeply rooted in emotion. Paul Ehrlich knew exactly what the council thought of him, telling his ZPG associate Richard Bowers that the Population Council, or at least its biggest wheels, hates my guts, those of Garrett Hardin, and indeed anyone else who has taken an approach to population control except their go slow and use family planning one. Notestein declined to review Ehrlich's 1970 book, Population, Resources, Environment, reasoning that I've been saying such nasty things about Ehrlich and doing so publicly, my friends would never believe I could give him an honest break. The point here is not that demographers were right and environmental Malthusians were wrong. Demographers were also wrong about a lot of things. And I write about that more in the book. The point here is just that there has never been a scientific consensus about the relationship between population growth and environmental degradation. So that gets us to part 3, the biogeopolitics of population control. Demographers and the Population Council supported population control, or family planning as they called it, as a means of stimulating economic development and preserving American global hegemony. But when it came to protecting the environment or solving any of the social problems facing the United States in the 1960s, they recognized that population control was a distraction rather than a solution. The only person in this story who really seems to have thought that population control could protect the environment was Paul Ehrlich. But even Ehrlich understood that population control was an indirect solution at best. He had embraced it only after the failure of his earlier attempts to promote the regulation of pesticide use in U.S. agriculture. He realized that it would be easier to regulate the reproduction of the world's most vulnerable people than to regulate the industrial production of the world's most powerful people. With fewer mouths to feed, there would be less agriculture and therefore less need for pesticides. Ehrlich's colleagues in Zero Population Growth advocated for population control not because they perceived it as the most effective means of protecting the environment, but because they perceived it as the most effective means of staving off environmental regulation. The organization's leaders explained that to the extent that we can protect the environment for future generations only at the expense to the present generation in material standards, government controls, and loss of freedom, or dependence upon foreign sources of supply, we will choose less environmental protection. As had been the case for Birch, Vogt, Osborne, Moore, and Draper, the leaders of Zero Population Growth sought population control to protect their access to environmental resources, not to protect the environment itself. By 1972, the U.S. birth rate had fallen to replacement, but the 1965 Hart-Celler Act expanded opportunities for immigration, particularly from Asia and Africa. Zero Population Growth refocused its efforts on immigration restriction, giving rise to a new brand of hate known as ecofascism. By the mid-1980s, eco-fascists had taken over an academic journal, Population and Environment. The journal had been launched in the early 1980s by the American Psychological Association to publish research on the social environment as a determinant of childbearing and other demographic behavior. It shifted its focus to the natural environment when Virginia Abernethy took over as editor-in-chief. Abernethy is a psychiatrist who's been described by the Southern Poverty Law Center as pushing repugnant race-based politics from behind an academic veneer. She edited the journal until 1999, when she was replaced by psychologist Kevin MacDonald, who the Southern Poverty Law Center describes as the neo-Nazi movement's favorite academic. During Abernethy's editorship, the journal focused on immigration, taking a nativist stance and painting immigration to the United States as a key driver of ecosystem degradation. During the MacDonald period, the journal became an outlet for racist evolutionary scholarship sponsored by the Pioneer Fund. Population and Environment worked as an academic cover for eco-fascism and scientific racism during the 1980s and 1990s because very little legitimate research was being done in this area at the intersection of population and environment. Natural scientists focused on the biogeochemical drivers of environmental degradation and climate change. Having established that human activities produce these biogeochemical drivers, which is true, they simply assumed that fewer people would mean fewer deleterious activities, which is not necessarily true. Demographers, meanwhile, were only just beginning to venture into environmental research in the 1990s. Their work primarily focused on the reciprocal relationship between population dynamics and environmental processes at the micro level, not the macro level relationship between population growth and climate change. Demographers did eventually take control of population and environment and ousted the white nationalists, so it is today a high-quality demography journal. Over the past 20 years, environmental concerns have emphasized climate change, and the concept of the Anthropocene has focused popular and scientific attention on human population as its primary driver. Meaning age of humans, the term Anthropocene centers humans as the dominant force shaping the Earth and its environment. This view is certainly accurate, but the term emphasizes the number of people rather than the activities that produce emissions. Early formulations of the Anthropocene concept included images like this one, which links socioeconomic trends to alarming Earth system consequences. Population growth takes a prominent place in the upper left corner, implying that it's the fundamental cause of all of the other changes, each of which accelerated dramatically after 1950. While it is true that the socioeconomic trends on the left drive the Earth system trends on the right, it is not true that population growth is the primary driver of the socioeconomic trends. People in different parts of the world live very differently, and the places where population has grown the most are not the places where most of the other socioeconomic trends have been concentrated. A 2015 revision of this iconic Anthropocene infographic acknowledged that discrepancy. Scholars in the environmental humanities have suggested changing the name Anthropocene to Capitalocene or Plantationocene to acknowledge that climate change is not driven simply by human being, but rather by human doing, specifically by economic systems that exploit vulnerable people and the Earth's resources. Attributing climate change to population growth is simply an accounting trick. At the global level, population and greenhouse gas emissions seem to have grown in tandem over the past 70 years. But while emissions have come primarily from the global north, the bulk of population growth has been in the global south. Even today, the countries that produce the most emissions have very low rates of population growth, and the countries with the highest rates of population growth contribute very few emissions. Per capita emissions calculations give the impression that fewer people would mean fewer emissions, but most emissions are caused by production rather than consumption, and the volume of production is much less closely articulated to the number of people than is the volume of consumption, especially when production is largely for export, as is the case in China, which is that huge pink box. Individuals can do only so much to reduce the emissions for which they're directly responsible. Corporations and governments can do a lot more. The decisions that make the most difference are the ones that are made farthest upstream. So how should we account for future emissions? Do we attribute them to future people, or to their parents? Or do we attribute them to the corporations that produce the fossil fuels that will generate emissions during those people's lifetimes, or to the governments that allow emissions to be produced? Today, the people who are least responsible for emissions are suffering the most dire consequences of climate change. The rate of world population growth reached its peak in the late 1960s and has been slowing ever since. The UN predicts that by the end of this century, there will be about 10.4 billion people on Earth, and that there will be very little subsequent growth. The increase from today's approximately 7.9 billion to the 10.4 billion of 2100 will result largely from population momentum, which Julia described yesterday. This means that it's easy to predict and difficult to change. We need to accept that this growth probably will happen and that it doesn't need to be a disaster. 10.4 billion may or may not be a sustainable number of people. Whether or not it is sustainable depends entirely on how well the world's governments work together to regulate emissions and protect people who are already experiencing the effects of climate change. 10.4 billion people is only unsustainable if we believe that regulation is impossible, which is what the fossil fuel industry would have us think. The world's population did grow dramatically over the course of the 20th century. But as we've seen in this talk, efforts to limit population growth have primarily served as red herrings, intended to promote such unsavory policies as eugenics and immigration restriction, or to deter economic redistribution and environmental regulation. Population control was never a good faith solution to real problems, and it remains a red herring today. As far-right nationalism grows across the world, and as climate denialism becomes more and more untenable, ecofascism grows as well. The concept of the carbon footprint elides the fact that emissions are driven by the organization of national and global economies, not individual decisions about how many children to have. Today, as in the times of Ehrlich and Hardin, Vogt and Osborne, and Pearl and East, environmental Malthusianism provides a veneer of scientific legitimacy for policies that police the reproduction of the world's most vulnerable people to distract us from more proximate causes of environmental devastation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it's time to move on to the Q&A part of the seminar. And I will just first say a few things about the people online, how they're going to participate. So you're going to use the chat function, and if you want to ask a question, you put your name and also your discipline. So we want to make sure we have a mix of different inputs from different disciplines. We also have a function of follow-up, so then you type follow-up to, and then the name of the person you want to follow up to. We have a parallel system in the room here, of course, with the just raise your hand and also show your finger if you have a follow-up. And we're going to make sure we mix both the online audience and the audience in the room, and also, as I said, the disciplines. So it won't be in the turn of the where you come in on the list, so to speak. I'll make sure we have a mix. Okay. So let's see. We have a few here. Yeah, Folke, do you want to start? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for this very informative talk. I just wonder, so these issues were intensely discussed within the academic sphere, but were they ever a concern for the general public, do you think? I mean, and did that vary over the years? Could politicians appeal to these problems and you know, to attract voters? And also about this zero population growth movement, was it ever popular? I mean, or just a concern for very few? I would like to ask an additional question, but not about the America situation, but about China. I mean, the one-child policy, was it, and maybe there's no way to know this, but was there widespread support for that among the general public? The general public in China, and do you know anything about that?
Okay, so I'll start with that question about China. So I don't know anything about how widespread support or not support was for the one-child policy. Something that Andrew mentioned yesterday is a fantastic book called One Quarter of Humanity. And it argues that in China, decisions about the number of children to have historically not been made by the couples having the children, but by other social institutions. So historically it was the family, like the multi-generational extended family. And so that book argues that a shift to state control over the number of children that people have was actually not that big of a change. But I personally don't know anything about popular support for the one-child policy. There was in the journal Demography a few years ago kind of a debate among demographers in different parts of the world about whether the one-child policy actually did reduce population growth, how different the population of China would have been without the one-child policy, and then a bunch of demographers saying that we can't even measure it in those terms because it caused so much suffering, so much human suffering. So that's a debate that happened between demographers. As for public support in the United States, so public opinion in the United States is very fickle. In the 1920s, people were a little bit concerned about population growth, not too much. In the 1930s, the public became very concerned about population decline, about the potential for population decline. So population was never actually declining in the aggregate, but demographers and mostly demographers and some pronatalists were kind of making very loud claims that population was going to start declining in the aggregate. And the eugenicists of the time actually really wanted to temper that kind of public fear because they were worried that if the public got too concerned about population decline, that they would start to support or call for dysgenic solutions. So solutions that would incentivize poorer people to have more children rather than middle-class people to have more children. And a big focus of demography research during the 1930s was kind of trying to figure out which policies would increase birth rates among the middle class without increasing them among the poor. So then with the baby boom, you get a new kind of concern about things like school crowding, never like overpopulation in a general sense, but crowding in local levels. But then in 1968, in the 1960s, late 1960s, there was a lot of popular support for overseas population control. And you saw non-trivial numbers of American young men having vasectomies to kind of do their part. And then that disappeared as soon as, 1972, the newspapers announced that the United States had reached zero population growth because we had, at that point, replacement fertility, and then nobody ever worried about population again. Although I will say that when the US reached this 2.1 total fertility rate, the organization Zero Population Growth actually tried to change the definition of zero population growth to actually no growth rather than a replacement fertility level, but that kind of population math was beyond the capacity of the American public to grasp.
Thank you. So that was a philosopher. Now we have a sociologist, Malcolm.
Thanks. That was really a wonderful presentation, very informative, I would say, particularly for those of us who are working on a project that is kind of funded by a wealthy donor who would like us to ask how many people can fit on the earth. So that was extremely helpful, if uncomfortable. I have a brief comment and a brief question. So my brief comment is, throughout your presentation, you sort of did these two things. You gave us, who said what, and a critique of what many people said. And the first part I accept, this is your area, and I think it was wonderful. But I would push back a little bit on some of your interpretation on the second part, in the sense that you did once in a while say, okay, it's not population, it's consumption. And I think first of all, I think it's actually kind of wrong. And second of all, I don't think it actually supports your argument, because consumption is what? It's consumption per capita times capita. Now, you focused on the capita and argued, very convincingly against that, and I agree with you about that. But that leaves us with consumption per capita. And I think if you stay in that sort of general framework, there's got to be either consumption per capita or capita. I think you're always going to be sort of finding that people want to return to the capita. And I think the problem is we should just stop talking about consumption and we should focus on what was part of your presentation, which was essentially industrial interests, lobbying by, powerful people who, don't want environmental regulation. I think that's really where we need to go and not talk about consumption. That's my objection, and you can say what you want about that. My brief question is something you said at the very beginning. You mentioned that efforts to sort of limit global or population growth in the developing world were particular focuses of, if I wrote it down correctly, the US, UK, Japan, and Sweden. And I was just wondering if you could say more about that, if I got that right.
Yeah. So I'll just say about your first comment, I think you're absolutely right. I totally agree with you that the focus should be on industry and production rather than consumption. And I've been moving in that direction as I rework these arguments. So, as I keep going forward, I will go further in that direction because I do think you're right. Okay, so about the countries that were most, so these are the countries that actually donated the most to various family planning and population control programs. So the US, by far, the US almost entirely funded the UN Fund for Population Activities for a long time. But the other big donors were to that organization and to organizations like Planned Parenthood were the UK, Japan, and Sweden. And Sweden actually has kind of a long history of eugenics. And there's a fantastic article by Anna Berg, I think is her name, about how the Swedish eugenicists after World War II went to India to start promoting family planning there, particularly using the rhythm method was what they had at the time. And so it's not a part of the story that I've done a ton of research on. But yeah, so it's, the story I tell is very US centric, but there were other countries involved. Countries that were not involved were France. So France had a whole entirely different tradition of demography that was much more pronatalist. And so France was not involved in these population control activities. And so the US trained demographers from most parts of the global south, but demographers from French-speaking countries were mostly trained in France in the pronatalist tradition. So this did create differences of opinion among countries in the global south. Also, countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union were also not on the population control train because of the kind of party line that overpopulation is only a problem under capitalism.
Fascinating, thanks.
Thank you, Thank you so much. That's super interesting, and I learned a lot. Now, I'm going to try to be charitable to these horrible people you've been talking about. Maybe not all of them are horrible, but I think all the ones you were talking about probably were. So, the first thing is that I don't think they are focused, or the ones that are serious, right? They're not focused on climate change because they know that with population momentum and we need to deal with climate change in the next 20, 30 years, forget about population. I think they're more concerned about other boundaries, like biodiversity, and they might be focused more on what will be a sustainable population from 2100 and forward. And there you can have different views. Some of these people worry that actually it's not possible to have a sustainable population at 11 or 12 billions. So I wonder what you say to them, so to say. And secondly, is it that, going back to your discussion with Malcolm, that you put all your trust in green growth, that this is going to be fine because we can have green growth, given that per capita consumption, we want it to go up for a lot of people. We want to bring people out of poverty. And actually some of these people that are a bit strange, but they also stress that they are thinking about how many people can it be if there is a consumption level at the average of Europeans, because they want everybody to have that. If they're sincere about it or not, I don't know. So if you have that, we're going to have a consumption average level of Europeans, and we're going to have a sustainable population from like 2100 forward, and we're going to respect all the planetary boundaries. How is that possible, according to you?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. So I don't mean to kind of promote green growth as the answer, because I think degrowth might be a better solution, and that yes, we do want for many people in the world to kind of increase their per capita level of living, but I think we can do that maybe by decreasing for some other people, particularly like in the United States, and that it's more a question of redistribution rather than green growth, is what I would say has to be the answer. As far as future sustainability, so according to the UN, it's unlikely that the world's population will get much past 10.5 billion. Definitely unlikely that it'll get to 11 billion. But it's possible, certainly. And and in order to protect all of the planetary boundaries, I don't know. I don't know that if that is possible, but I think it is possible to sustain human life at that level in a way that can continue forward. But I don't know a ton about biodiversity.
Let me rephrase the question a little bit differently. I mean, you focused on all this project focused on like 2100 was a stop point.
Yeah.
I think some of the people they're thinking beyond that.
Yeah.
As we're doing climate change modeling, they're thinking about 2300 or something like that. And of course, there are certain trajectories given the birth rate where it could start falling, which we also worry about given that how our economic system is organized. But is there no discussion among these people that you looked at? They always looked in this very, from the perspective of philosophy, rather short term.
Yeah. Yeah, so the people I'm talking about are certainly not looking that far forward. Demographers really don't look that far forward. Yeah, and I don't know, we were having a discussion last night about how useful or how productive is this like very long-termism. And I don't know, but I think that, so if trends continue as they are, the very long term is unlikely to see, but there's really no way to predict anything, that far out. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for this. As a historian, I'm always been more focused on the past.
Thank you. It's time to now go online, and we have Bo Malmberg, Human Geography and Population Geography.
Okay, thank you for an interesting presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. I have 3 comments. First, I missed a few first minutes of your presentation, and maybe you said that, but when you're listening to you have I think, very clear US perspective, which I think that needs to be emphasized. So I react when you say that demography started with Lotka, then you really cut off like 200 or 300 years of developments of demography before Lotka. That is then mainly in. And it's also, I also think that you haven't kind of discussed the neo-Malthusians, that they deserve to have a place, because as I understand, in Sweden we had the Knut Wicksell, who was very important and very influential in the Swedish population debate. But his main concern wasn't really, I think, about the macro effects, but his idea was that by favoring contraceptions, you could reduce poverty because the families, you could reduce the dependency rate among families, and so that really brings a kind of different perspective on efforts to do population policies. And also when you look at the Swedish efforts in relation to population family planning, I think that it has a root in this neo-Malthusian perspective, where you can see a direct effect that families, that is a kind of, it's a way of empowering women. If you have fewer children, it will be easier for you to provide for your children and so on. So So it's not really this. You are very much into these kind of large effects, and then they may be there, but there are also other kind of motivations for population for family planning, and then also with respect to environmental effects. You have a very broad definition of environmental effects. If you, as it goes a little bit to what Gustav was saying, is that Paul Ehrlich, he was as you said, he was a researcher on what it's called. He was interested in biodiversity. So, and that is also what you see now, is that most of the arguments then against population growth is really kind of giving priority to other species in relation to humans. And if you look at the relation between human population growth and the diversity of the space that is available for other species, I think there the effects are quite clear. And what you could look at there is the forest transition literature, where you can see that population growth is then very strongly related to deforesting. And when population growth goes down, you have reforest. So in that respect, I think there is. You hear me?
Yes.
Sorry for the telephone. So that the last comment then is on the effects of lower fertility on economic growth. There now, the evidence is very, very clear. You didn't mention at all the demographic dividend literature, where there is very clear evidence that lowering birth rates, in fact, has a very positive effect on per capita income growth. But that could be an argument again. There are some people that say that we can save the climate by having fewer children, but the answer is to the contrary. It's because they have fewer children in China that they have become such have had such strong economic growth and have become polluters. So that might be both to be considered. So you shouldn't kind of. I think that argument has been clarified in the last 20 years that lower fertility is good for economic growth.
Thanks. Yeah, so the U.S. focus, I did have a little disclaimer about that at the beginning of the story, or the beginning of the talk. And part of the reason for that is that every idea comes from somewhere, and the history of environmental Malthusianism has been pretty clearly traced to this origin in U.S. geopolitics. So that and then the demography before Latka. So yes, absolutely. There were activities of population accounting and analysis, as you say, for hundreds of years prior to Latka. I locate the origins of demography in the interwar United States because that's where we see demography becoming an academic science rather than an activity of governments or mostly governments, so vital statistics. So it's kind of the where I place Latka is in that transition from vital statistics to demography, and that transition included the kind of bringing together of a few different things. So vital statistics, biology, eugenics kind of come together in that Latka moment, and that's where I cite the beginning of demography. The word demography was not used before that. It was, and I think language matters, and that's why I identify that moment as the origin of demography. But yes, there were certainly precursors going back hundreds of years. So then the neo-Malthusians, and so by neo-Malthusians, you mean, I think, people who promoted family planning as a way to bring families out of poverty and to promote economic growth. And there's a lot more about that in the book. So this talk was focused on the environmental side of the argument. The book focuses on both the environmental and the economic. So I get at the neo-Malthusians there, although I don't love the term neo-Malthusians because I as I argue in the book, demography was really not Malthusian. But yes, so for demographers, that was the purpose of family planning, was to alleviate poverty, to promote kind of international, less poverty, so more of an international equality, and that there were problems with that rationale for population control also, and largely that there was actually never any evidence that that family planning did have any of these other effects. So there was the Cole-Hoover study, which I talked about in this talk and at greater length in the book, but that the Cole-Hoover study really was just the only kind of empirical research that was ever done during this period on that question of the relationship between population growth and economic growth. It was a simulation study, so it was really its outcome was entirely determined by by the model, and that once that study was done, the kind of entire field of demography shifted to, okay, now how do we get people to use birth control? So it was, okay, we've got this evidence, now how do we get people to use birth control? And no, I didn't talk about the demographic dividend, but I do in the book, just very briefly in the epilogue. And, you know, the demographic dividend is kind of, I think for me, really an example of the fact that lower fertility does not necessarily translate into more economic growth or economic development. In order to get that demographic dividend, you have to have the right kind of infrastructure, healthcare, job opportunities. And so this is really evidence that population control is not kind of an automatic stimulus to economic development. Biodiversity and the question of priority to other species, the forest literature, this is definitely something I'm going to have to look at more. So I'll get back to you on that.
You wanted a short reply, right? We have quite a few on the list, so keep it
Yes,
short.
yes, but then I would say that's not finding new Malthusian is important. Could it be based that you have this U.S. perspective? If you look at the Swedish debate, that it's a very, very prominent idea, and it's also very, very prominent as a motivation for family planning. And I think that the evidence there that you on the micro level you can see very strong correlation between family structure and economic, and that's, for example, in Roundtree in the English literature, is a really major factor for family poverty is lots of children. So that gives a different perspective on the people that go out and try to promote family planning. It doesn't really have to be about saving the earth. It's really about kind of giving a chance for families to control their economic situation. And also with the demographic dividend, the evidence, there are very, very few examples of people reducing fertility and getting the demographic that don't get economic growth. So it's not about other policies, really. It's a really strong effect of population. I think the evidence there is very, very clear.
Okay, so let's move on. And now it's Hilary Greaves.
Hi, thank you for a very refreshing talk. I enjoyed it a lot. So just to pick up on one thing where I thought, hang on a minute. You said most emissions are caused by production, not consumption. And I took it the train of thought was, therefore, we should be focusing on sort of intervening on the corporations and not intervening on the individuals and their reproductive choices. So this strikes me as a false dichotomy, and I feel like there's something I'm not understanding. So it doesn't seem to me to make sense to blame production to the exclusion of consumption because of simple laws of supply and demand. Corporations will produce only to the extent that there's demand for the things that they're producing. Maybe to focus thoughts, I could think, right, okay, if I had a way of halving the size of population, other things being equal, then among other things I would be halving the amount of corporate activity, maybe the number of corporations or the size of the corporations. And so if we were holding fixed the pollution intensity of corporate activity, I would be halving the amount of pollution. So given that train of thought, can you explicate in what sense it's the corporations and not the consumers?
Yeah, so I was talking specifically about Yes, this idea of carbon emissions per capita. So what this calculation does is it takes all of the carbon emissions in a given country and divides it by that country's population. And so if a country is producing a lot for export, it's going to keep producing that much, even if there's fewer people there, because the goods are the demand for the goods is coming from elsewhere. So having the population of China isn't necessarily going to have industrial production in China. So that's what I was getting at, is just that that articulation. So with fewer, so if you have half as many consumers, you can probably expect half as much consumption. But if you have half the population, you're not necessarily going to cut production in half.
Right, but if we were either thinking at the global scale rather than country by country, or if we were attributing emissions to countries in the first place based on consumption rather than production, then that reply would not get into the picture, I take it.
Yeah. So if we were thinking about the world as a whole, then yes. Yeah. But that this also kind of assumes what you were saying, like a supply-demand economy, where production meets demand, but it can also be the other way around. So, for example, if it became illegal worldwide to produce plastic, other things would have to compensate for that. And as much demand as there could be for plastic, it's going to get shifted to other things.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to stop there. There's one person left on the list, but I think, Christian, you can talk to her during the lunch. I guess you're here, both of you. Before we end, I will just want to mention that there are two upcoming research seminars on October the 12th, Christian, actually, Barry, which emissions belong to us, and October the 26th, we have Victoria Space and Nicole Nisbet, Climate Crisis Norm Entrepreneurs, How Successful Are They? But now, time to thank you for a very interesting talk.